I wanted to talk about my work in 2019 through 2022, which feels like a long time ago because it was prior to my time at CTU. But I did do a lot of work with my team at Marquette University, where I used to work as a theology professor. So my talk today is called The Truth About Power, the Need for Power Literacy in Catholic Sexual Violence Prevention Education. So a little bit about me and from where I speak. I think it's important to, tell you a little bit about from where I'm speaking. First of all, my outfit choice, I'm wearing a necklace made by my toddler son today with muffins with mommy that we had this morning. And so if you're just amazed by my necklace, that's the backstory of it. I've been balancing, the slow and steady work of love with navigating being a professor and a formator and also being a mom and a wife. We were cleaning up vomit on Wednesday night at like midnight together and we're just like looking at each other like, yeah, this is the work, right? Um so I'm a cradle Catholic. I born and raised Catholic and went to Catholic school my whole life. And that's really important for my work. I'm a Catholic schoolgirl, from the start, and that really influenced my dissertation work, which I'll talk about in a second. I'm biracial Latina. My mom's from Mexico, and my dad is from New England, hence my last name. And yeah, I think for me, as a Catholic schoolgirl, we have a lot of cultural and gender scripts that we carry with us from our education. So for my dissertation at Loyola University Chicago, where Kevin went as well, I wanted to focus on the sexual education of Catholic young women. I wanted to ask young women through ethnography, what did you learn about sex ed in your Catholic context, and how did that affect you today? And so I asked 18 to 25-year-old young women about their sex ed and their gender socialization and how that affected them. And then I also, 5 years later, I interviewed women at Marquette. And I found that even 5 years difference, there wasn't really that much different, a little bit different, but that was my dissertation work. And so in 2019, as I was a professor of theology and ethics at Marquette University, Fordham University received a grant. And their grant project was called Taking Responsibility. Jesuit educational institutions confront the causes and legacy of clergy sexual abuse. So they said, we have this grant. Fordham got this grant, and we want to take responsibility and give you all these Jesuit universities throughout the US to give you sub-grant money to take responsibility. And you pick a topic in your context that you want to work on. And so with my colleagues at Marquette, we have a lot, they have a lot of ethicists that are pretty amazing. And so we kind of gathered together and said, like, what is our responsibility? What are we going to research and do with this grant money? And so we decided, the ethicists in the department, we decided we wanted to focus on the laity. The laity we were part of the laity, but also sometimes when we talk about clergy sexual abuse, we're really focusing on things like clericalism or, formation and gender socialization within priests. But I think it's important on the other side to notice that we are all part of a church together. And so how can we focus on empowering the laity within this culture of sin? And so I decided to focus on the adolescent team because that was what my dissertation was about. It was adolescent girls. And I said, okay, if I'm going to do this work, this feels heavy. It's hard to talk about sexual violence. But if I am going to do this work, I need to call up my friend Mark Levant. And Mark is not only a theologian, but he's also a certified sexuality educator, and he teaches, especially Catholic higher ed institutions, how to talk about sex. So I was like, Mark, we need you. And then I also worked with a PhD candidate, Kathy Molesky-Dante, who had an MDiv, is a licensed social worker, and was working on her dissertation about clergy sex abuse. So we three worked together to build what is now called Empowering the Laity, best practices for empowering the laity for adolescents. And our colleague, Connor Kelly, actually did Empowering the Laity for adults. And so he led adult workshops in Milwaukee around examination of conscience and the spiritual exercises as a response to sexual abuse. So I will talk about our section, which was about empowering adolescents. So outline of what I'll be talking about today. I'll first go over some of our research and our analysis of the existing safeguarding materials. So safeguarding is another word for sexual violence education materials. So you've probably, if you've worked in a Catholic context, you've had to take these online, mainly online courses. And then I'll talk a little bit about the educational workshop we created for teens in Milwaukee. And then I'll finally wrap it up by talking about equipping young adults through power literacy. So our project, we had a focus on lay empowerment, which was very different from the other projects. If you want to look it up, taking responsibility and just Google it through Fordham University, you'll see all of the different projects, and they're amazing. Santa Clara did a project where they interviewed religious about their formation and sexuality, and they talked about clericalism that they found in those formation surveys. There is another university that did the history of sexual violence at their institution and really went into the history and told difficult truths about that. One university followed it, they called it One Bad Apple, and they followed this one priest and kind of the effects of the violence in the community. So yeah, it was refreshing to feel like our focus was on, okay, we're going to empower the laity here, instead of maybe just focusing on clergy in this. So our hypothesis was that we, without even looking at the material from our own lived experience as Catholics and as theologians, we thought that there would be a lack of concrete language about power and autonomy in a lot of the Catholic safeguarding curricula. Mark, the sexuality educator, he is very, up to date on interdisciplinary studies and intimate partner violence studies. And he, noted that sexual violence a lot of the time is not about sex, it's about power. And so how are we talking about power in Catholic spaces, if at all? And then we wanted to produce public-facing resources. So on the Taking Responsibility website right now, we produced lesson plans that you can use in your own environments. And we wanted them to be free for everyone. And then finally, we wanted to kind of craft what would holistic, developmentally appropriate sexual violence prevention education look like. So when we, went about our research, we did content review and analysis. So we gathered all of the curricula we could find in the United States. We combined them with trends in education. So, social science. We combined them with trends in psychology, in sexuality studies, women and gender studies, social work, domestic violence, etc. And then we created a workshop for the laity in Milwaukee. And that was done in 2021, 2022. So something that Kathy, our graduate assistant, found was that on the USCCB website, there was a document that was later taken down that she was worried was up there by accident, and that she was wondering if she could still use it. And we just talked about it and said, if it was publicly available at that time and you downloaded it, like, we can use it for the resources. So it was through the United States Council of Catholic Bishops. And what we found is that they had their own list in 2018 of existing materials for sexual violence education. And out of the 197 dioceses, there were 161 materials. So this alone, just those numbers show you that we don't have very much uniformity in terms of like curriculum requirements, standards, a general kind of, I don't know. It's really a choose your own adventure wherever you're going. And some of the I'll go into this later, but some of the materials are not really described. They just say other, or they'll describe a kind of more secular legal program. So some of them aren't even rooted in theology. I think to be charitable, I think that it could be helpful to choose a curricula based on your own context. But the fact that there are so many different materials just feels like, we're not combining resources for best practices. So out of our research, we saw that about 11 producers of sexual violence curricula produce about 51% of the material. And so the top three, which maybe you've heard of, are Virtus. Another one is called Circle of Grace, and the other one is called Presidium. And those three make up 32% of the material in the United States. The remaining 49% are other. So it could be different local and government agencies. Some of them are unspecified materials, like some of them said safeguarding materials, or just various. So it was pretty alarming just to see how many different types of resources there were. Some of them very unspecific, and some dioceses had numerous curricula. So it's you're unsure of how people kind of pieced things together. We did talk to some catechists in Milwaukee, and they said, yeah, I kind of like wrote my own because I couldn't really find anything that was okay. And that's fine if you have the training and the education, but I think people are really kind of searching for something that would fit their context. So we did have a lot of barriers to access. For Circle of Grace cost thousands of dollars to purchase. And so we didn't have the money in our grant to buy Circle of Grace to look through the whole curricula. We did find a sample curricula, and they did not respond to our emails. They said you could only purchase it if you were a director of religious education. The other major material resource is called Child Lures, which is an unfortunate name. And they had a flat out refusal to share their materials because they were suspicious that we were either going to copy, we were just going to copy it and sell it for ourselves, or they were suspicious that we were investigating as researchers. So, this kind of like closed loop, just non-transparent system within sexual violence education is troubling, to say the least. We wanted to improve and empower people that are receiving these materials, and so that lack of consistency we were unable to see a lot of the materials. There was a lot of lack of consistency in self-reporting in the spreadsheet as well. So some of the themes, we were able to review the top three, even if only parts of them. Some themes that we found was that a lot of these materials focus on prevention and reporting problematic behaviors. And so it's kind of like calling things out after the fact. So like, if you see this, then this. Whereas you can build what my colleague calls strengths-focused lessons, which talk about like ways that you can engage in the world, understanding scenarios, and identifying vulnerable situations within power structure. The second thing is there were no references that I saw to Catholic social tradition, and so a lot of it was seen as what Marvin was talking about as an individual private enmity. So private actions, private sins that individuals do to each other. which Catholic social tradition could talk a lot about, this, it's a structure, it's a culture. And then there really lacked attention to gender and the role that gender socialization plays in power in relationships. So there also wasn't very much attention to the idea that there's a clergy laity power imbalance in a lot of situations. And something that was interesting in one of our workshops in Milwaukee is that we were literally talking about clericalism and clergy, and the priest from the parish came into the room, and all of the young people stood up and just were like quiet. Yeah, because they were in small groups talking and just like learning. And all of a sudden he just came in and they stood up. And we're like, this is literally the power dynamic that we're talking about. Not because there's anything wrong with, stopping and paying attention to somebody, but the fact that they felt like they had to give deference because it was a priest that walked into the room instead of, let's say, me. So after we looked through the curricula that we could, we paired it with these trends in healthy relationship education. And a lot of these trends are secular from, the social sciences, from sexuality studies. And this is where my colleague Mark really used his expertise. He said that studies show that addressing gender socialization in sexuality education and sexual violence prevention education actually is very successful in helping people understand their agency and their autonomy. So, having an aha moment of this is how gender sometimes plays out in terms of power in our society. It is very important to identify unhealthy relationship habits. And so what we did in our workshop, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is we used the wheel of power and control, which is often used in domestic violence education. And we told them it's not just about physical violence. There are many different types of unhealthy relationship habits that can be a form of violence. It is very important to address power in relationships. Not only that people have power over you, but you have power in yourself. And we all have power. It's not a bad thing. It can be used to empower and to liberate others, but it can also be used to destroy and harm. So the way in which we are using our power is important. And power, is more or less based on your social identity as well. So, even though everyone does have power, that's very much influenced by things like race, gender, sexuality, if you're clergy, if you are the laity, etc. And then finally, awareness of your own moral agency. So a lot of the students that we encountered didn't really realize that they had their own autonomy and agency, and they hadn't heard those words before, that they were in charge of their bodies, that they had the ability to say no, even to somebody in power. They really were like receptive to that lesson, and they also had not heard it before, which was sad to me. All right. So our workshop, we ended up holding our workshop at two different places. One was a parish, and it was a mixture of middle school and some high school students. And then the second was at a high school. It was all girls, Catholic high school, so it was only high school aged. So our workshop, we only had 3 hours, but we wanted to push everything in there that we could. And so luckily they, I think the teachers gave extra credit or something, but we were able to talk, to give them, a lot of different topics. We talked about identifying different types of relationship, that there are different kinds of power in relationships, and that we are all in relationship with each other. We talked about unhealthy habits, how to identify them, and how do you disrupt or address them. And then we also led them in a spiritual examen, which is a Jesuit prayer practice at the end, to talk about your own relationships and the power that you have within them. So we talked about, we gave some case studies of examples of, situations where some person might have more or less power than another. And we would ask them, who has power in this relationship? What kinds of power do they have? How is the power being used or abused? And then do any of the areas on the wheel of power and control fit here? How so? And you can't really see the individual spokes in the wheel on this slide, but if you look it up online, you'll see that there's some types of power that maybe they hadn't thought of before, like peer pressure is a type of power, isolation, coercion, threats, intimidation. Those are all different forms of power and control that can be abused in a relationship. And so we had teens, we made case studies for them, and then we had them identify how power was at work. And, when we were done, we were really interested in the fact that a lot of the people reported in their surveys at the end of the workshops that they had not heard of these things before, even in high school, and that they were really interested to learn more. The middle schoolers, actually, we had to spend quite a bit of time talking to them about harm prevention, like what happens if one of your friends, they really wanted to know, like one of our friends talks about ending their life, like what do we do? And so our social worker, she really stepped up then, but there's a lot that comes out in these conversations that 3 hours really can't contain. So I hope that they continue to talk about these things now. So what we realized is needed is just a deep theology of power and power literacy in our education, especially for young people. And theologies of power, that's something that is, we can talk about in a religious context where we are emphasizing mutuality in relationships versus identifying whether it's a unilateral, so one way, power only going one way, or hierarchical model of relationship, which unfortunately a lot of models in our church are hierarchical or unilateral. The idea that God gives us power, it's a gift of power to humans, but the gift of power is meant to build community, meant to build the kingdom of God and the beloved community, and to actually enlarge both your and other people's freedoms. The idea that all people have power in relationships is pretty profound for the young adults, but some people do have more or less than others due to their social identity. And then what is needed is a truth telling about domination in the church and about liberation. So the church, Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, a feminist theologian, said that the church as a discipleship community of equals should not be power over. We should never be wielding our power over other people, but unfortunately, that's what's been happening in our kind of colonial and patriarchal history. Rather, instead of the idea of power over, we should think about power should be used to liberate. We should have power with other people. Or as womanist scholar Pamela Cooper-White says, power in community. We're never just wielding power alone. We're always connected to other people. And so how do we think about power in a liberative way in the community? Because we're all connected. One of my Pathways scholars and I went to community organizing workshop a few months ago, and the executive director of Coalition for Spiritual and Public Leadership said that there's also something called power within, and that's the Holy Spirit kind of infusing you with the power to liberate others. So the responses. My presentation today was about responding to difficult truths. So I really want to emphasize talking about empowering and equipping youth, especially the laity. So educating youth about the role of power in relationships and society, it's going to be messy, especially within a Catholic context, because that involves telling the truth about the power, the unjust power that the church has wielded over its history, and talking about the truth about clerical power and sexist power. Second, there needs to be discussions about how gender scripts contribute to power within society. And if you know anything about sexual ethics or sexual anthropology in the Catholic Church, you wouldn't be surprised that we didn't find the word gender in any of the sexual violence curricula, which is one of the things that's actually studies show improves people's sexual education. And then third, safeguard trainings should be grounded in social ethics. So it's not helpful to have safeguarding trainings be about individual behaviors. Just one bad apple, look out for that one bad apple. They should be grounded in this idea that this is the culture that we live in, that at least in the Catholic Church, there's a culture of sin within sexual violence. And the recognition that these are structures of sin that it is the air that we are breathing. That is the reason that the numbers are so high. It's not just one individual action. And finally, we put at the end of our article, which we just got published in Journal of Moral Theology, ask young people what they want to know. So ask young people, what would you like to learn about topics of abuse and violence? And that's really scary to ask young people. I taught high school for a few years, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But people will, if you genuinely want to ask, people will ask questions about hard things, especially within the church. And so I kind of wanted to end with, of course, nodding to Pope Francis. Being attentive to what young people need presents an opportunity for active listening on the part of Catholic leaders and allows youth to contribute their own agency and creativity in responding to the sexual abuse crisis, fulfilling Pope Francis's vision of a listening church.